The back corner of room 203 was where Jasmine Williams always sat in Mr. Peterson's advanced calculus class, not because she wanted to hide, but because from there she could see everything: the board, her classmates, and most importantly, she could watch how others reacted when she spoke up. Being one of only 3 black students in Roosevelt High's prestigious math program made her highly visible, yet somehow overlooked at the same time. Jasmine adjusted her glasses and opened her worn notebook. The bell hadn't rung yet, and students were still filing in, laughing and talking about their weekend plans. Nobody sat next to her. They never did. The empty chair beside her had become such a normal sight that she'd started using it to spread out her extra books. Roosevelt High was known for its math and science programs. Getting into advanced calculus wasn't easy. Students needed recommendation letters, excellent grades, and perfect scores on placement tests. Jasmine had all 3, yet she constantly felt the unspoken question hanging in the air: does she really belong here? What they didn't know was that math had always been Jasmine's secret world. A place where problems had solutions, where effort led to clear results. While other kids played video games after school, Jasmine would spread textbooks across her bedroom floor. Not just her assigned school books, she had university-level calculus texts borrowed from her cousin Tasha, who studied at MIT. Those looked pretty tough. Her mom had said one evening, peering at the complex equations Jasmine was working through, "You sure that's high school math?" "It's not," Jasmine had replied without looking up. "It's what comes next." The previous night, she'd stayed up late solving problems nobody had assigned her. Her small desk lamp cast a warm circle of light as she worked through differential equations that wouldn't appear in Mr. Peterson's class for weeks. When she finally got stuck on a particularly difficult problem around midnight, she didn't give up. Instead, she took a different approach, breaking it down into smaller pieces until the answer revealed itself like a puzzle coming together. Now, as the final bell rang and Mr. Peterson walked in, Jasmine tucked away her extra work. She'd learned early on not to show too much enthusiasm. The one time she'd corrected Mr. Peterson's minor calculation error, the whole class had fallen silent. Mr. Peterson had fixed the mistake with a tight smile, saying, "Well, even a broken clock is right twice a day." The class had laughed, and Jasmine hadn't raised her hand again for 2 weeks. Mr. Peterson began writing equations on the board while explaining last week's test results. The class average was 76, he announced, handing back papers. When he reached Jasmine, he placed her test face down on her desk without comment. She turned it over, 94%. The highest score in the class, she suspected, though he never announced who did best unless it was one of his favorite students. Jasmine had worked twice as hard for that 94%. Not because the material was difficult, but because she double and triple checked every answer, knowing a single mistake would reinforce what some teachers already thought: that her presence in advanced classes was some kind of fluke or worse, the result of lowered standards. As Mr. Peterson started the day's lesson on integration techniques, Jasmine took careful notes. Her handwriting was small and neat, filling the margins with additional insights from her extra reading. A boy 2 rows ahead kept turning to glance at her, surprised each time she answered a question correctly. The truth was, Jasmine didn't just understand calculus, she loved it. She loved how patterns emerged from chaos, how rules governed everything if you looked closely enough. In math, your background didn't matter. Your skin color didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was whether your answer was right or wrong. As the lesson continued, Jasmine worked through each problem methodically. What nobody in that classroom realized was that the quiet girl in the back corner wasn't just keeping up, she was already miles ahead, solving tomorrow's problems today. Little did they know that tomorrow, everything would change. Monday mornings were always tough, but this one felt different. The autumn air had turned crisp overnight, and frost covered the school lawn as Jasmine hurried into the building. She'd stayed up late again, working through extra problems until her eyes burned. Now, with her math folder clutched to her chest, she fought back a yawn as she entered Mr. Peterson's classroom. Something was off. Mr. Peterson stood at the front, rocking back and forth on his heels with a strange smile on his face. Usually, he'd be writing formulas on the board or checking homework, but today he just watched as students filed in, that odd smile never leaving his face. "Good morning, everyone," he said once the bell rang. His voice had that tone, the one that made Jasmine's stomach tighten. It was the voice he used when he was about to do something unpleasant. Jasmine slid into her seat and pulled out her notebook, keeping her eyes down. Maybe if she didn't look up, he wouldn't call on her. "Today," Mr. Peterson announced, picking up a piece of chalk, "I have something special planned." He tapped the chalk against the board. "A challenge problem." The class groaned collectively. Challenge problems were notorious, difficult equations that few could solve, meant to separate what Mr. Peterson called the real mathematicians from everyone else. "This one's particularly interesting," he continued, beginning to write on the board. The white chalk scratched out a complex differential equation that filled nearly half the space. It combines several concepts we've covered, plus a few we haven't gotten to yet. The equation grew more complicated as he added terms and symbols. Some students had already started scribbling in their notebooks, trying to make sense of it. Others just stared, bewildered. When Mr. Peterson finished writing, he dusted chalk from his hands and turned to face the class. His eyes swept across the room until they landed directly on Jasmine. "This might be beyond some students' capabilities," he said, not breaking eye contact with her, "but I'd like to see who rises to the occasion." Several students near the front exchanged glances. A boy wearing the school's basketball jacket snickered, and soon others joined in. They all knew who Mr. Peterson was talking about. Jasmine felt heat rising in her cheeks. She wanted to look away, but forced herself to meet his gaze. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Extra credit for anyone who solves it correctly," Mr. Peterson added, finally looking away. "You have until the end of class. Begin." Papers rustled as students got to work. Jasmine stared at the equation, her heart pounding. It was intimidating, intentionally so, but as she studied it, pieces began to look familiar. The first part resembled problems from her cousin's textbook. The middle section incorporated theorems they'd covered last week. The end had elements they hadn't learned yet, but she recognized them from her late-night studies. Mr. Peterson began walking between the desks, peering over shoulders. He offered quiet hints to certain students, never to her, of course. When he reached the front row, he stopped beside a boy wearing an expensive watch, the class president's son. "Good approach," Mr. Peterson murmured, pointing to something on the boy's paper. "Try using substitution for that part." 20 minutes passed. Frustrated sighs filled the room as students hit roadblocks in their solutions. Jasmine had filled 2 pages with work, but kept hitting dead ends. The problem was deceptively complex. Just when she thought she had a path forward, a new complication emerged. Mr. Peterson continued his rounds, eventually making his way to the back where Jasmine sat. He paused behind her, his shadow falling across her paper. She could feel his presence, waiting for her to ask for help so he could dismiss her. Instead, she kept working, her pencil moving steadily across the page. He leaned closer, examining her work without comment. "Don't worry about it, Ms. Williams," he finally said, just loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "Some concepts are simply impossible for certain students to grasp." A few students laughed. One girl whispered something to her friend, and they'd both glanced back at Jasmine with barely concealed smirks. Mr. Peterson moved on, but his words hung in the air. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her pencil tighter. The equation blurred before her eyes as she blinked back tears of frustration. She took a deep breath. This wasn't about just a math problem anymore. This was about something much bigger. The classroom felt smaller than usual as Jasmine tried to focus on the impossible equation. Her pencil hovered over the blank page, not because she didn't know where to start, but because Mr. Peterson's words had knocked the wind out of her. She glanced around the room. Almost everyone had returned to their work, but a few eyes still darted her way, watching for her reaction. Jasmine took a deep breath and wrote down the first step. Then another. Her hand moved mechanically while her mind raced. This wasn't the first time Mr. Peterson had singled her out, but it was the most obvious. Usually his comments were subtle, a raised eyebrow when she got something right, or "Are you sure about that?" when no one else received such questioning. Across the room, the class clown whispered something that made his friends laugh. One girl looked back at Jasmine with what might have been pity before quickly turning away. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room, each second a reminder that time was passing and her page remained mostly empty. Mr. Peterson continued his rounds, stopping at various desks. Good effort, he murmured to one struggling student. You're on the right track, he encouraged another. When he reached the desk of the football team captain, a boy who rarely completed assignments but never faced consequences, Mr. Peterson spent 5 minutes explaining a concept step by step. Jasmine watched from the corner of her eye, her stomach tightening. She'd asked for help once, early in the semester. Mr. Peterson had sighed heavily before saying, perhaps you should review the basics before attempting advanced work. She hadn't asked again. Now, as if sensing her thoughts, Mr. Peterson glanced her way. Their eyes met briefly before Jasmine looked down at her paper. She heard his footsteps approaching. Still struggling, Ms. Williams? He asked, loud enough for nearby students to hear. Jasmine didn't look up. I'm working through it, sir. Mr. Peterson picked up her paper without asking. He studied it for a moment, his expression shifting from expectation to surprise, then quickly back to something harder. She had made more progress than he'd anticipated. Interesting approach, he said, placing the paper back down. Though I'm afraid you fundamentally misunderstood the concept. Jasmine knew she hadn't. The approach was unconventional, yes, but mathematically sound. Before she could respond, a boy too rose up called out. Mr. Peterson, is this problem even solvable? It seems like it might be impossible. Mr. Peterson smiled. Good question, Tyler. For some students, it certainly would be impossible. But for those with true mathematical talent, there is always a solution. His eyes flicked meaningfully toward Jasmine. The message couldn't have been clearer if he'd spelled it out. Several students snickered. Maybe it's just too advanced for certain people, a girl whispered loudly to her friend. Yeah, some people should stick to basic math, her friend replied. Jasmine's face burned. She wanted to stand up, to tell them all that she'd been solving university-level equations for months, that her cousin's MIT professor had praised her work. Instead, she sat frozen, staring at her paper as the quiet laughter rippled through the classroom. Mr. Peterson did nothing to stop it. In fact, he seemed pleased as he returned to the front of the room. 20 more minutes, he announced. Though I suspect we already know who'll succeed and who won't. Jasmine's hands trembled as anger and humiliation babbled inside her. Her pencil snapped under the pressure of her grip. Ink leaked onto her paper, blotting out her work. It felt symbolic somehow, her efforts erased, just like her presence in this classroom. A quiet tap on her desk startled her. The boy who sat in front of her had turned around and silently offered a spare pencil. His face showed no mockery, just a simple gesture of support. Jasmine took it with a small nod of thanks. As she wiped the ink from her hands, something hardened inside her. The whispers continued. Mr. Peterson's smug expression remained. But something had changed in Jasmine. She picked up the new pencil and started again, this time with a different approach. The equation that had seemed impossible now looked like a challenge she refused to back down from. Each symbol, each variable became a personal affront she would overcome. She wouldn't just solve this problem. She would master it. And when she did, no one in this room would ever underestimate her again. The bus ride home felt longer than usual. Jasmine stayed out the window, barely noticing the neighborhoods passing by. The math problem was etched into her mind like it had been carved there. She'd spent the rest of class trying different approaches, but the bell had rung before she could finish. Mr. Peterson had collected everyone's papers with a satisfied smirk, as if the outcome had been exactly what he expected. How was school? Her mom asked when she walked through the door. Mom was still in her nurse's scrubs, having just returned from her day shift at the hospital. Fine, Jasmine mumbled, heading straight for her room. She couldn't bring herself to explain what had happened. How could she tell her mom that her teacher had publicly humiliated her? That he'd practically announced to the whole class that she didn't belong there. Dinner's at 6. Her mom called after her. Jasmine closed her bedroom door and dropped her backpack on the floor. She pulled out her math notebook and flipped to the page where she'd copied down the problem. Sitting at her small desk by the window, she stared at the equation, letting the anger fuel her focus. I'm not giving up, she whispered to herself. Not now. Not ever. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and started over. This time, she broke down the problem into smaller pieces, tackling each section separately. The sky outside her window darkened as minutes turned into hours. When her mom knocked on the door to call her for dinner, Jasmine jumped, surprised that so much time had passed. "I'm not hungry," she called back. "You need to eat something," her mom insisted. "I'll grab something later, I promise." Her mom sighed on the other side of the door but didn't argue further. Jasmine knew she should take a break, but the problem had become personal. It wasn't just about math anymore, it was about proving herself. By 9 o'clock, her desk was covered with papers filled with calculations. She'd gone through 3 different approaches, each one getting closer but still missing something essential. Her eyes burned from straining in the dim light of her desk lamp, but she refused to stop. She reached for her cousin's university textbook and flipped through the pages until she found a section on complex differential equations. As she read, something clicked. The problem Mr. Peterson had given them combined elements from different chapters. That's why it seemed impossible at first glance. "Wait a minute," she whispered, flipping back a few pages. There was an alternative method mentioned briefly in the textbook, one that approached these types of problems from a completely different angle. It was advanced, something they hadn't covered in class, but Jasmine had read about it during her late-night study sessions. Excitement pushed away her exhaustion as she started fresh on a clean sheet of paper. This new approach simplified parts of the equation that had seemed impossibly complex before. The clock on her bedside table showed 11:30 p.m., then midnight, then 1 a.m., but Jasmine barely noticed. She worked steadily, pausing only to check her calculations. Each step forward gave her more confidence. When she hit another roadblock around 1:30 a.m., she closed her eyes and visualized the problem from yet another perspective. That's when the second breakthrough came. There's an even simpler way, she realized, her pencil flying across a new page. This approach wasn't just correct, it was elegant. It transformed the intimidating problem into something beautifully straightforward. At 2:13 a.m., Jasmine wrote down the final answer and circled it twice. She checked her work once, twice, 3 times. Each time, the solution held up. She had not only solved the impossible problem, she had found 2 different ways to do it. Her eyes were bloodshot, her back ached from hunching over her desk for hours, and she'd missed dinner completely. But as she looked at her solution, a slow smile spread across her face. For the first time since Mr. Peterson had written that problem on the board, Jasmine felt at peace. She carefully copied both solutions onto fresh paper, making sure every step was clearly shown and perfectly neat. No one would be able to question her work. No one would be able to dismiss her achievement. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, everything would change. As she finally crawled into bed at nearly 3 in the morning, exhaustion overtook her immediately. But even in her dreams, numbers and equations danced behind her eyelids, no longer threatening, but beautiful in their perfect logic. Morning came too quickly. Jasmine's alarm blared at 6:30 a.m., and she groaned as she reached to silence it. Her body felt heavy after only 3 hours of sleep, but her mind was sharp, focused on what lay ahead. She dressed quickly, checking twice to make sure her solutions were safely tucked in her folder. "You look tired," her mom said as Jasmine grabbed a piece of toast on her way out. "Were you up studying again?" "Something like that," Jasmine replied. She wanted to explain everything, the problem, the mockery, her breakthrough, but decided to wait. Words wouldn't matter now. Only results. The walk to school seemed shorter than usual. Each step brought her closer to the moment she'd been preparing for. Her heart pounded as she entered the school building, nodding at the few students who greeted her in the hallway. Jasmine arrived at Mr. Peterson's classroom 20 minutes early. To her surprise, the door was already open, and Mr. Peterson sat at his desk, grading papers. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from surprise to something like resignation. "You're early, Ms. Williams," he said, checking his watch. "Yes, sir," she replied, taking her seat at the back of the room. She pulled out her notebook, but kept her solutions hidden inside her folder. The minutes ticked by slowly as other students gradually filtered in, filling the classroom with their usual morning chatter. When the bell rang, Mr. Peterson stood and addressed the class. "Yesterday, I gave you all a challenge problem," he began, picking up the stack of papers from his desk. "As expected, most of you struggled with it. That's understandable, it was designed to be difficult." He began returning papers with red marks all over them. Most students looked disappointed but not surprised. The class president's son received his with a shrug. The basketball player crumpled his immediately. 2 students managed partial solutions. Mr. Peterson continued, handing papers to a boy and girl in the front row. Good effort, though there were fundamental errors in your approach. Jasmine noticed he hadn't called her name or returned her paper. Her palms grew sweaty as she waited. Would anyone like to share their approach to the problem? Mr. Peterson asked, leaning against his desk. His eyes deliberately avoided the back corner where Jasmine sat. The room remained silent. A few students exchanged glances, but no one raised a hand. The class president's son finally spoke up. I tried working backward from what I thought the answer might be, but got stuck halfway through. Mr. Peterson nodded. Creative, but unfortunately not viable for this type of equation. Another student explained his attempt, followed by a third. Each received polite feedback, with Mr. Peterson gently explaining where they had gone wrong. All the while, Jasmine sat quietly, waiting for the right moment. Well, Mr. Peterson finally said, it seems this problem was indeed beyond the scope of this class. As I mentioned yesterday, some concepts are simply. Jasmine raised her hand. The motion was small, but somehow it seemed to cut through Mr. Peterson's words like a knife. He paused mid-sentence, his eyes finally landing on her. For a long moment he said nothing. The classroom grew uncomfortably quiet. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he nodded toward her. Ms. Williams? Did you have a question? Jasmine shook her head. Not a question, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I have a solution. A boy near the front snorted in disbelief. Someone whispered something that made others laugh quietly. Mr. Peterson's expression remained neutral, but Jasmine caught the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. Do you now? He asked, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. Rather than argue, Jasmine stood up. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Without a word, she walked to the front of the class, a folder clutched tightly in her hand. When she reached the whiteboard, she turned to face Mr. Peterson. May I? She asked, gesturing to the markers. He hesitated, then stepped aside with a wave of his hand that suggested he was merely humoring her. By all means. Jasmine uncapped a blue marker and began writing. Her handwriting was clear and precise as she laid out the first steps of her solution. The classroom fell silent, not the mocking silence of yesterday, but a true stunned silence. Line by line, step by step, she filled the board with her work. No one spoke, no one laughed. Even Mr. Peterson remained frozen, watching as his impossible problem yielded to Jasmine's methodical approach. When she reached the halfway point, she paused and turned slightly. The look on her classmates' faces, a mixture of shock, confusion, and growing respect, gave her the final push of confidence she needed. She continued writing, her marker moving smoothly across the board as she demonstrated not just the standard approach from her first solution, but began laying out her alternative method as well. The only sound in the classroom was the soft squeak of Jasmine's marker against the whiteboard. Everyone watched as equation after equation filled the space, forming a path through the mathematical wilderness that had stumped them all yesterday. Even the class clown, who never paid attention to anything, sat up straight, his eyes fixed on Jasmine's work. As she completed the standard solution, Jasmine paused, capped the blue marker, and picked up a green one. There's another way, she said quietly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. A simpler approach. A whisper rippled through the classroom. Mr. Peterson's eyebrows shot up, but he remained silent, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face had lost its usual confidence, replaced by something that looked almost like worry. Jasmine began writing again, this time showing her alternative method. This solution was more elegant, requiring fewer steps and revealing connections between concepts that weren't immediately obvious. She discovered it during those early morning hours when most of her classmates were still asleep. The class valedictorian leaned forward in his seat, his mouth slightly open. He quickly jotted notes, trying to keep up with Jasmine's work. 2 girls who had laughed at her yesterday now watched with wide eyes, occasionally glancing at each other in disbelief. When Jasmine wrote the final answer, the same result as her first solution but reached through a completely different path, she underlined it twice and stepped back. Her hand trembled slightly as she capped the marker and placed it on the ledge. For a moment, she stood facing the board, gathering courage before turning around. The classroom remained perfectly still. 30 pairs of eyes stared at her, some with open admiration, others with shocked disbelief. No one spoke, no one moved. Mr. Peterson broke the silence first. He stepped forward, eyes narrowed as he examined her work. He traced each step with his finger, checking her calculations, searching for errors. The seconds stretched painfully as he moved from one equation to the next, his face impossible to read. Jasmine held her breath. Despite her confidence in her work, doubt began to creep in. Had she missed something? Made a careless error in her exhaustion? Finally, Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "This first approach," he said, pointing to her blue solution, "follows standard methods, though with unusual clarity." His voice sounded strained, as if the words were difficult to push out. He moved to the green solution. "This second approach," he paused, studying it once more. "I've never seen the problem solved this way before." The boy who sat next to Jasmine's empty seat raised his hand. "Is it correct?" he asked, saying out loud what everyone was thinking. Mr. Peterson's shoulders tensed. For a brief moment, Jasmine thought he might deny it, might find some technicality to dismiss her work. Instead, he turned slowly to face the class. "Yes," he said, the words seeming to cost him something. "Both solutions are correct." The classroom erupted. The class valedictorian started clapping first, a slow, deliberate applause that others quickly joined. Soon the entire room filled with the sound, growing louder as students who had never spoken to Jasmine before smiled at her with newfound respect. "That was amazing. How did you figure that out?" "I didn't think it was even possible." Comments flew from all directions. The basketball player whistled loudly. The class president's son nodded at her with obvious admiration. Even the girls who had mocked her yesterday looked slightly ashamed as they joined the applause. Mr. Peterson stood silently amid the commotion, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. Surprise, yes, but also something that might have been shame, quickly masked by a professional nod. "Well done, Ms. Williams," he said when the noise finally died down. "It seems I underestimated you." Jasmine met his eyes directly for the first time. "Yes, sir," she said simply, "you did." The boy who'd offered her a pencil yesterday grinned widely. The girl who sat in front of him turned around to ask Jasmine a question about her second approach. 2 more students moved closer, pointing to specific steps in her work, asking how she'd made the connection. As the classroom reorganized itself around her achievement, Jasmine felt something shift inside her chest. The heavy weight she'd carried for months, the burden of being constantly underestimated, of having to prove herself over and over, seemed lighter somehow. Not gone completely, but different. For the first time since joining the advanced class, she wasn't the black girl in the back who somehow got lucky to be there. She was simply Jasmine Williams, the student who solved the impossible problem. Twice. The days following Jasmine's triumph brought changes no one could have predicted. When she walked into class the next morning, the empty seat beside her was taken. The class valedictorian had moved there, notebook open, ready with questions about her alternative solution method. By lunchtime, word had spread through the school. "You're the girl who solved Peterson's impossible problem," a sophomore said as Jasmine stood in the lunch line. The most surprising change was in Mr. Peterson himself. The smug certainty that had defined him was replaced by something more measured. He no longer skipped over Jasmine when asking for volunteers. Instead, he often called on her first, his tone respectful where it had once been dismissive. During a particularly difficult lesson on integration techniques, Mr. Peterson paused halfway through his explanation. "Ms. Williams," he said, glancing toward the back of the room, "perhaps you could explain this concept to the class. You have a gift for making the complex seem simple." 2 weeks ago, such a request would have terrified her. Now, Jasmine walked at the front without hesitation. As she broke down the problem step by step, her classmates nodded with understanding. The girl who had once whispered that Jasmine didn't belong now copied her methods carefully. After class, a boy who had been struggling all semester approached her desk. "Could you maybe help me with yesterday's homework?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I just don't get it." Before Jasmine could answer, 2 other students joined him. "We could start a study group," one suggested, "if you're willing to lead it." That afternoon, Jasmine found herself in the library surrounded by 5 classmates, including some who had laughed at her just weeks before. As she explained concepts they'd been struggling with, their respect was obvious in every question, every nod of understanding. The news reached beyond her classroom. One morning, the principal stopped Jasmine in the hallway. "I heard about your mathematical breakthrough," she said. "We're looking for students to represent Roosevelt High in the state mathematics competition. Would you be interested?" Jasmine had never considered herself a competitor. Math had always been private, something she did alone in her room with only her textbooks for company. But something had changed inside her, a confidence that made her nod yes before she could overthink it. The preparation for the competition became her focus over the next month. She stayed late after school, working through practice problems with Mr. Peterson. Their relationship had transformed into something neither could have imagined before, not quite friendship, but a mutual respect built on shared passion for mathematics. "You approach problems differently than anyone I've taught," Mr. Peterson admitted one afternoon as they worked through a particularly complex equation. "It's refreshing to see." "I've always seen patterns where others see complications," Jasmine replied, surprising herself with her candor. He nodded slowly. "That's the mark of a true mathematician." The day of the competition arrived with spring sunshine and nervous energy. Jasmine's mother took the day off work to drive her to the university campus where it was being held. "I'm so proud of you," she said, squeezing Jasmine's hand before she joined the other competitors. The problems were challenging, pushing even Jasmine to her limits. But with each question, she found herself falling back on the confidence she'd built since that pivotal day in class. When the results were announced, Jasmine's name was called for first place. The gymnasium erupted in applause as she accepted the trophy, but hands trembling slightly under the weight of her achievement. When she returned to school the following Monday, a small celebration awaited in Mr. Peterson's classroom. Someone had brought cupcakes, and a handmade banner hung across the whiteboard. "Congratulations, Math Champion." As the bell rang and students took their seats, Mr. Peterson stood at the front of the room. "Before we begin today's lesson," he said, his voice carrying unusual emotion, "I'd like to recognize Jasmine's extraordinary achievement." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Though I must confess, I always knew you had extraordinary potential." The words hung in the air between them. They both knew it wasn't true. They both knew he had dismissed her, underestimated her, expected her to fail. But they also both understood that sometimes acknowledging a past mistake is the first step toward a better future. 3 months later, when Jasmine's early acceptance letter from MIT arrived, she brought it to school. After class, she placed it on Mr. Peterson's desk without a word. He read it quickly, a smile spreading across his face. "They're lucky to have you," he said simply. Jasmine nodded. "I know," she replied, with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned the most important lesson of all, not to let anyone else define her limits.